station because he had been picked up in one of the earlier protests a couple of days ago, and he found that all the people who had been arrested were just young boys, the oldest of them 19 or 20 years old, and he felt embarrassed, and so he took his son to the protest this morning, saying that we all have to be out there, and today we found women, men, old, young, children, all out in the streets protesting against the Mubarak regime.
It's a different country now, isn't it, Timothy? Completely from the one it was even just a few hours ago.
Oh, things have changed pretty dramatically. I mean, just this morning when I was in taxis before the protest got underway, the drivers were excited. They were telling me how they were going to park their cars and go out and protest as soon as prayers were over. There's a clear energy there. I found a lot of people who normally completely apolitical committed to going out just today. And saying that it's come time.
Timothy, great talking to you. Timothy Carter's there giving us a real picture of what's going on at street level in Cairo. Thanks for that. We have two guests in London. I've got to thank both of them for staying with us because obviously we've had a lot of breaking news going on, a lot of events happening, but they've both stayed there. I'm going to go to Nabila Ramdani first for your thoughts on, well, the last hour of what you've seen, the fact that a curfew was put in place, it has done absolutely nothing.
Well, I think it's fascinating to note that the ruthlessness of the crackdown on demonstrators is paralleled by an equally ruthlessness on a crackdown on the media coverage, as you raised earlier. We've seen everything used by the security forces against demonstrators, from tear gas to water cannons to rubber bullets, baton charges, and there are even strong rumours that live ammunition is being used against demonstrators. And similar draconian and, dare I say, sinister tactics are now being used to prevent media coverage to show the reality of what's going on the ground and to try to underplay and indeed minimise the scale and the intensity of what's going on in Egypt at the moment across the nation. And we have seen a crackdown on not only Egyptian journalists. Obviously we're dealing with a country where the media are hugely restricted and indeed state controlled for the most part, but also crackdown on foreign journalists. I think a British journalist was injured earlier on today. Several of them were arrested. French journalists were arrested as well. So we're definitely witnessing a desperate attempt by the regime to suppress any form of coverage of the situation to try to give the impression that
they used there, and that was intensity. It's one thing to protest. It's one thing to protest in Egypt. What we see here is a completely other thing.
Well, let's put things in context. Just a few weeks ago in Egypt, we used to say that political apathy was one of the major problems facing Egyptian society. Political apathy, that people were not interested, engaged, were terrified to come out on the streets. Most of the protests in the last few years did not number more than 1,000 or 2,000 protesters. That told you a great deal about the political climate in Egypt, about fear. And also another point to highlight in terms of context, the opposition was deeply fragmented, was deeply splintered along ideological lines, along political lines, along personality lines. Look what's happening today. Now you have tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of Egyptians on the street. We don't know the numbers yet because we don't really have a full picture of what has transpired in Egypt today. Now you have a unified opposition, a rainbow opposition coalition. You have the Muslim Brotherhood, you have centrists, you have young men and women, you have Ayman Noor, you have Muhammad al-Baradei, you have Kifaya, a unified oppositional force that's basically making its voice heard, making a change in Egypt. And thirdly, it seems to me, the introduction of the military in Egypt changes the matrix of politics in Egypt. That is, the security apparatus of the Mubarak regime has failed, and failed dismally, to basically control the protesters. And finally, what you're seeing in Cairo, what's alarming about what we are seeing in Cairo is the lack of control. That's basically the protesters control the streets. We don't see the security forces, we don't see the police, we see fires raging, and that fire, by the way, is next to one of the most important buildings in Egypt, the museum. The Egyptian museum is the jewel of all museums in the world. This would be a cultural catastrophe. It reminds me of the first few days of the American invasion of Baghdad and what happened in Baghdad. Remember, the Egyptian Revolution of 1952 took place in July 1952 after Cairo was burned a few days earlier by protesters protesting the British and the police force in Egypt. This seems to be a repeat of what happened in 1952. And the introduction of the military in Egypt in 1952 brought about the Egyptian Revolution in 1952, and that's why I think that Mubarak's introduction of the military into the political scene of Egypt could really mark a watershed, a pivotal moment. We might be witnessing the beginning of a new era, not just in terms of a new language of politics, but also a new era of politics. Of course, we have to be careful about pontificating and speculating, but the reality is Egypt today is a dramatically different country than 4 days ago. And if Egypt goes, I don't need to tell you, Egypt is the key that unlocks the Arab East and North Africa. If Egypt goes, the entire region goes. It is one of the most pivotal countries in the Middle East, and that's why I think Hillary Clinton's statements today testifies to the anxiety of the Obama administration, and that the reality on the ground is changing, and changing rapidly, spiraling out of control, it seems. And that's what we hope, that the military would quieten things up, and basically that hopefully tomorrow, when the dust settles, we might see a new era, a new face, a new character in Egyptian politics.
Fawaz Gerges and Nabila Ramdani, two experts who stayed with us.